Salesforce owner-based sharing rules. Today we continue our dive into Salesforce security, record level security, and we're diving into owner-based sharing rules. And as I've discussed in past videos, record level security is the mechanisms for controlling whether or not a record is visible to a user. To me, this is the equivalent of having file level access in a file cabinet. You've controlled whether or not they can get to the file cabinet into an office through profile and permission set security, but determining which particular records they get access to is going to be driven by record level security. Now, some of the ways to share a record are out of the box, and some are specified by configuration or code. We're going to be going over those that are specified by configuration. There are limitations on the user license. This requires that the user have access to the share table, which is enabled for internal Salesforce internal users, but not for customer community users. Customer community plus partner communities, they do get access to the share table. So in a previous video, we talked about criteria-based sharing rules, where you select the criteria of a record, determine the sharing level, and select the target. Now, you are only allowed 50 criteria-based sharing rules on a particular object. And I believe that that is because Salesforce needs to be monitoring all the fields on an object to see if the change in a field value would trigger a sharing calc, meaning it would trigger a particular record to meet a new sharing rule or to no longer meet a sharing rule. If it meets a sharing rule, it needs to be added and all the targets need to have their share records added. Or if a criteria changes so it no longer meets, then Salesforce has to process the removals of the share records. So because of that overhead, I believe that is a reason why there is the 50 limit on the number of criteria-based and guest-based sharing. Now we're moving on to owner-based sharing, where you're selecting the owner, determining the sharing level, selecting the target. And you're allowed up to 300 of these. And I believe that that is because Salesforce only has to monitor for the creation of a record, determining who the owner is and assigning into the target share groups, or checking for an ownership change. So therefore, these 300 only needs to monitor for an owner change to determine whether it needs to issue the recalcs. So we're going to be diving into owner-based sharing. So you determine and create a share rule. You give it the label, the name, the description. You pick it based on the owner. And then step 3, you're going to be determining which records based on who owns it. So step 4, you're determining who the target is. And step 5, the level of access. So if we look at this, which records shall we share based on this rule? So this rule, which you can have up to 300 of, assuming that you haven't consumed criteria rules or guest-based sharings, you will say this is a bucket of records driven by either a group of individuals, roles, or subgroups in a public group, in a role, and if you choose a role, their subordinates also. So if you choose a manager and they have assistant managers, it will cover those as the source. Or you could choose roles, internal and portal subordinates. So this way you could choose ownership of an external record, an external role. This assumes customer community plus or above. It's going to determine who's in this source bucket, reading all the users in that source bucket, and then designating them as part of in scope for this rule. Public groups are very powerful. They can create other groups, and they can create roles and subordinates. So if you take a look at a particular rule, you can make the source a group, and you can expand the source by adding other subgroups and other roles and subordinates to that source group. So one way for for one particular one of these owner-based sharing rules to become expansive in its source is by making it a public group and adding to the public group. Now, you're going to determine who gets the shares. And again, you could be targeting a public group which can contain other groups and can contain roles, and subordinates. So this can be very powerful. Your target can be very wide by using a public group. So you can see that if you have a wide public group as the source and a wide public group as the target, you can include roles, and internal subordinates, and as such. And then you're going to determine the level of access. So you're going to determine whether they have read-only or read-write. And we are assuming that when you have this level of access, that the target users have the profile permission set access to match. So you can grant them read-write, but if their profile permission set only allows read, they won't get write. They need both the profile permission set access for write, and they'll need the share level access for write. They need both of those to match in order to have access. So when you target access, okay, so here are some examples. So if you you have a particular record and you want to share with a regional vice president number 2, you could make them the target of your share right here. Now, if you wanted only them to have access, then you would designate that target as the regional vice president. But if you wanted their subordinate managers and assistant managers here to have access, then you would designate this as the regional VP, number 2, and subordinates, which would grant it downward. It would skip region 1, and the senior VP would get it because of the hierarchy. Now, if you wanted to target hardware and software, you could target a product VP and subordinates, which would then give you everyone below. Or you could target one and create a public group. You could target one role, a second role, and then you could put both of these roles in a public group. So you want to be looking on your targeting. Who is the group you're trying to target? Where is the target position in the hierarchy? And determine, do you want to go downward in opening up visibility? If you want to go downward, include subordinates. If you don't want to go downward, don't include subordinates. And if you need to include multiple sets, you can decide you don't need to create multiple rules. If they all have the same source, you could just add these to a group and support VP and subordinates to a group. So both of those, put them in a group. So that is the power of the group, is that you can add additional elements into the group, either at the source level for the owner-based sharing rule or the target level. So this is a very powerful rule. You need to know your role hierarchy, and you need to understand the power of the groups. So owner-based sharing is going to be a very powerful mechanism. You're going to create your buckets of the sources, your buckets of the targets, and create those sharing. Now, one thing to remember is if your buckets need to be granular, and let's assume you have a bunch of regions and you want to have the records from here shared with one region, the records shared with another region, and each one of those separate buckets of records will consume a sharing rule. Now, if you exceed the 300, that means 300, not 300 targets, but 300 separate targets. You need to realize that you will be beyond the bounds of owner-based sharing rules. So it's not, do you want to include more, which you can do by increasing the scope of the target. It's, are there separate buckets of sharing, like separations of groupings? And if you're looking at hitting 200 to 300 separate buckets of groupings of shares, you're going to go beyond the capabilities of owner-based sharing. So those are some key elements as you choose. Criteria base is based on the criteria of the record, and you can only have up to 50 buckets. Owner-based sharing is wider, less overhead. You can go up to the total sharing rules of 300. But if you get beyond that level of fidelity, of separation, then you're going to not be able to use this sharing mechanism. Hope this was helpful, and keep on owning the sharing. Join me again, same bat time, same bat channel. Subscribe to SteveTechArc on this YouTube channel, or come to www.stevetecharc.com and have a great day.